The first sound that pierced the howling Dakota wind wasn't human. It was the desperate scratching of something alive against wood, frantic and rhythmic, like a heartbeat racing against time. Margaret Sullivan pulled her wool shawl tighter and pressed her face to the frost-covered window of the stagecoach. Through the swirling white, she could barely make out the outline of what the driver had called a way station, nothing more than a crude wooden shelter built into the hillside, meant to offer travelers refuge from the brutal plains storms. But that scratching sound, that wasn't the wind. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The November blizzard of 1887 had transformed the Dakota Territory into a white wasteland where even seasoned travelers lost their bearings. Margaret Sullivan clutched her carpetbag closer as the stagecoach lurched to a stop outside the weathered shelter. She was 3 days out from Chicago, heading to the frontier town of Cedar Falls to marry a man she'd never met, a widowed shopkeeper named Thomas Henderson, who'd promised her security and a respectable life in exchange for companionship and help with his general store. At 26, Margaret had exhausted her options in the city. The bank had foreclosed on her family's boarding house after her father's death, leaving her with nothing but debts and a reputation tarnished by circumstances beyond her control. The advertisement in the Chicago Tribune had seemed like providence. Respectable gentleman seeks educated woman of good character for matrimonial purposes. Steady income and comfortable home assured. Now, as she stepped down from the coach into knee-deep snow, Margaret wondered if she'd made a terrible mistake. The driver, a grizzled man named Jake Morrison, was already unhitching the horses with practiced efficiency. "Storm's getting worse, ma'am," he called over the wind. "We'll need to wait it out here. Could be hours, could be days." The way station was little more than 4 walls and a roof, built against a natural depression in the hillside. A single chimney promised warmth, though no smoke rose from it now. Margaret followed Morrison toward the heavy wooden door, her boots sinking with each step. The scratching sound came again, more urgent this time, and she stopped. "Did you hear that?" Morrison paused, his hand on the door latch. "Hear what?" "Scratching. Like something trying to get out." The driver's weathered face creased into a frown. He pressed his ear to the door, and his expression changed. "That ain't right," he muttered, throwing the latch and pushing the door inward. The smell hit them first, not the expected mustiness of a closed space, but something sharper. Unwashed bodies, sickness, and the metallic tang of extreme cold. Morrison stepped inside first, and Margaret heard his sharp intake of breath. "Sweet Lord in heaven." Margaret pushed past him into the dim interior, and her hand flew to her mouth. The single room was larger than it had appeared from outside, carved partially into the hillside itself. A cold fireplace dominated one wall, its stones blackened but long cold. Rough wooden benches lined the walls, and scattered across the floor were piles of what she first took to be discarded rags. Then one of the piles moved. "Help!" came a voice so weak it might have been the wind. "Please help us." As Margaret's eyes adjusted to the gloom, the terrible truth became clear. They weren't rags at all. 7 children, ranging in age from perhaps 5 to 15, huddled together in various states of collapse. Their clothes were little more than tatters, their faces gaunt with hunger and blue-tinged with cold. The oldest, a boy with dark hair matted against his skull, was the one who had spoken. His arm was wrapped protectively around 2 smaller children who appeared unconscious. Morrison swore under his breath and immediately began gathering deadwood from a pile near the fireplace. "How long have you been here?" he called to the boy. "While working to build a fire." "Don't know," the boy whispered. "Days, maybe weeks. We ran out of food. His voice trailed off as his eyes rolled back. Margaret dropped her carpetbag and knelt, Beside the nearest child, a girl of perhaps 8 with tangled blonde hair. The child's skin was like ice. Her breathing so shallow Margaret had to put her ear to the girl's chest to confirm she was still alive. One by one, she moved to each child, checking for signs of life, her heart breaking with each discovery. 7 children. 7 souls abandoned to die in this godforsaken shelter. The oldest boy managed to focus on her face. "Are you an angel?" he whispered. "No," Margaret said firmly, her voice steadier than she felt. "I'm very much alive, and so are you." "What's your name?" Samuel Porter." He gestured weakly toward the other children. "This is my sister Mary, and that's little Tommy, the others. We found them on the road, they're folks." He couldn't finish. Margaret's mind raced as Morrison coaxed a flame to life in the fireplace. She opened her carpet bag and pulled out a small sewing kit, then began tearing strips from her petticoat. The children needed warmth, food, and immediate medical attention, but the storm raged outside with no sign of letting up. "Mr. Morrison," she called, "what supplies do we have?" The driver was blowing on the struggling fire, his face grim. "Not much, ma'am. Some hardtack, dried meat, coffee." This was just supposed to be a brief stop. He glanced at the children and shook his head. "I don't understand how they got here. This station's been closed for months since the railroad changed its route." As the fire began to catch, casting flickering light across the room, Margaret could see the children more clearly. Besides Samuel and his sister Mary, there was Tommy, who couldn't be more than 5. His small body curled against Samuel's side. Near the far wall, 3 more children huddled together. 2 girls who appeared to be twins, perhaps 10 years old, and another boy of maybe 12 with red hair and freckles. The 7th child, a girl of about 6 with dark braids, lay motionless. Near the fireplace, Margaret moved to this last child first, pressing her ear to the girl's chest. The heartbeat was there, faint but steady. She began rubbing the child's hands and arms, trying to restore circulation. The girl's eyelids fluttered. "What's your name, sweetheart?" Margaret whispered. "Emma," came the barely audible reply. "Emma. Collins. Well, Emma Collins, I'm Margaret, and you're going to be just fine." She wasn't sure if she was lying or not. As Morrison fed the fire and the room slowly began to warm, Margaret moved from child to child, learning their names and assessing their conditions. The twins were Lucy and Lillian Hayes, orphaned when their parents' wagon had overturned crossing the creek. The red-haired boy was Benjamin Murphy, whose family had died of fever on the trail west. Each story was a tragedy, each child a survivor of circumstances that would have broken many adults. "How did you all come to be together?" Margaret asked Samuel as she wrapped him in her traveling shawl. "Different times," he said, his voice growing stronger as warmth returned to the room. "Mary and Tommy and me, we've been on our own since Ma died last spring. Pa never came back from the war. We was trying to get to our aunt in California, but he gestured helplessly. Got separated from the wagon train in a storm. Been walking for days when we found this place. The others? Ben found us first. Then the twins. Emma was here when we got here, all alone. Been taking care of each other best we could, but the food ran out, and the cold." His voice broke. Margaret felt something fierce and protective rise in her chest. These children had been failed by every adult who should have cared for them. Orphaned by death, disease, and the brutal realities of frontier life, they had somehow found each other and survived through sheer determination and the oldest child's desperate courage. Morrison approached with a pot of melted snow that was beginning to steam. "Water's warm," he said quietly. "Got some coffee brewing too, though it might be too strong for the little ones." Margaret nodded, accepting the cup he offered. She tested the temperature, then carefully lifted Emma's head to give her small sips. The girl's eyes opened fully for the first time, focusing on Margaret's face with wonder. "Are you really real?" Emma whispered. "Yes, darling. I'm real, and I'm here." As the fire grew stronger and the bitter cold began to retreat, Margaret found herself facing a choice that would define the rest of her life. The storm might trap them here for days. Even when it passed, these children had nowhere to go. Samuel had mentioned an aunt in California, but that was hundreds of miles away with winter setting in. The other children were truly alone in the world. She thought of Thomas Henderson waiting for her in Cedar Falls, of the comfortable life he'd promised, of the security she'd traveled so far to find. Then she looked at Emma's trusting eyes, at Samuel's determined jaw, at little Tommy's peaceful face as warmth and hope returned to his small body. Outside, the wind howled like a living thing, but inside the shelter, 7 children were beginning to believe in tomorrow again. Margaret Sullivan had come west to start a new life, but she was beginning to understand that her new life might be nothing like what she'd planned. The scratching sound that had first alerted her hadn't been desperation, it had been hope, refusing to give up even in the darkest hour. As she held Emma close and watched the other children slowly return to life, Margaret realized she was hearing the same sound echoing in her own heart. She had found them, but perhaps they had found her too. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The second day brought a brief lull in the storm, though the wind still moaned through the gaps in the shelter's walls like a restless spirit. Margaret had barely slept, keeping vigil over the children as they slowly returned to life. She'd rationed Morrison's supplies, carefully thin broth made from dried meat, tiny portions of softened hardtack, and endless cups of weak coffee mixed with melted snow to keep them hydrated. By morning, all 7 children were conscious and aware, though still weak. The transformation was remarkable. Samuel Porter, who had seemed near death just hours before, was now sitting upright, his arms still protectively around his little brother Tommy. The boy's natural leadership qualities emerged as his strength returned. He helped distribute the meager breakfast, settled disputes between the younger children, and somehow maintained hope in circumstances that would have crushed many adults. Margaret found herself drawn to each child's story as the day progressed. With the immediate crisis past, they began to open up, sharing fragments of their past that painted a heartbreaking picture of frontier life's brutal realities. Benjamin Murphy, the red-haired 12-year-old, spoke in a thick Irish accent inherited from parents who'd fled famine only to find death on the American plains. His family had been traveling with a group of Irish immigrants when fever struck their wagon train. Ben described watching his parents and 3 siblings succumb one by one until he was the sole survivor. The wagon master had wanted to leave him with a family in the last town, but Ben had slipped away in the night, determined to reach San Francisco, where his uncle supposedly ran a boarding house. "I can work," Ben insisted to Margaret, his green eyes fierce with determination. "Back in County Cork, I helped me Da with his carpentry. I'm not afraid of hard labor." The twins, Lucy and Lillian Hayes, were harder to draw out. At 10 years old, they communicated more with each other than with the outside world, finishing each other's sentences and sharing looks that seemed to convey entire conversations. Their parents had been schoolteachers from Ohio, heading west to establish a school in Oregon Territory. When their wagon had overturned crossing the swollen creek, both parents had drowned trying to save their possessions. The twins had survived by clinging to an overturned barrel for hours until other travelers found them. "We can read and write," Lucy whispered to Margaret when her sister dozed off. "Papa taught us Latin too, and Mama showed us figures. We're not stupid, even though some folks think so because we don't talk much." "Nobody thinks you're stupid, sweetheart," Margaret assured her. "Sometimes the smartest people are the ones who listen more than they speak." Little Emma Collins proved to be the most mysterious of the group. At 6 years old, she had been alone in the shelter when the others arrived, but she couldn't or wouldn't explain how she'd gotten there. She spoke with a slight southern accent and had calluses on her small hands that spoke of hard work. But when asked about her family, she would only say they were gone to heaven. Margaret suspected there was more to Emma's story, but she didn't press. The child had survived something traumatic enough to make her retreat into protective silence. Tommy Porter, Samuel's 5-year-old brother, was perhaps the most resilient of all. Despite everything he'd endured, he still possessed the natural optimism of childhood. He attached himself to Margaret immediately, following her around the shelter and chattering about everything from the pretty colors in the fire to his plans to become a cowboy when he grew up. Mary Porter, Samuel's sister, fell somewhere between her brothers in age and temperament. At 8, she was old enough to understand their dire circumstances, but young enough to still believe in fairy tale endings. She had appointed herself Margaret's helper, mimicking everything the older woman did and hanging on her every word. As the day wore on, Margaret found herself making difficult calculations. Morrison had enough supplies for perhaps 2 more days if they continued rationing carefully. The storm showed signs of breaking, but even when it ended, the nearest town was at least a day's travel through snow that would be knee-deep on the children. More troubling still was the question of what would happen to them once they reached civilization. She knew the harsh realities facing orphans in frontier towns. If they were lucky, they might be taken in by families needing extra hands for farm work, essentially becoming indentured servants. More likely, they would be separated and sent to overcrowded orphanages in distant cities, if such institutions even existed in this part of the territory. Boys like Samuel and Ben might survive on their own through odd jobs and determination, but the younger children, especially the girls, faced a bleak future. Miss Margaret? Samuel's voice interrupted her dark thoughts. He was sitting by the fire, whittling a piece of wood with a small knife Morrison had lent him. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Why are you being so kind to us? Most folks... He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Most folks see orphan children as a burden. You don't even know us." Margaret considered the question seriously. It deserved an honest answer. "I suppose it's because I know what it feels like to be alone and afraid," she said finally. "My father died last year, and I lost everything, our home, our business. Even friends who couldn't be bothered with a woman who had no money or social standing. I was lucky enough to have options, even if they weren't the ones I would have chosen. You children deserve the same chance." Samuel nodded thoughtfully. "Are you really going to marry a man you never met?" "That was the plan." Margaret realized she was speaking in the past tense and wondered when that had happened. "Don't you want to marry for love? Like in the stories?" Margaret smiled sadly. "Love is a luxury most people can't afford, Samuel. Security and kindness matter more than romantic feelings when you're trying to survive." "Maybe," Samuel said, returning his attention to his whittling. "But seems to me like love is what makes survival worth it." The wisdom in those words, coming from a 15-year-old boy who had every reason to be bitter and cynical, took Margaret's breath away. She found herself studying his face in the firelight, seeing not just the child he still was, but the man he was becoming. Samuel Porter had the kind of quiet strength and natural leadership that would serve him well in life, if he lived long enough to grow into it. As afternoon faded toward evening, Morrison returned from checking on the horses with news. "Storms breaking up," he announced, stomping snow from his boots. "Should be able to move on by morning, though the going will be slow." The children received this news with mixed emotions. They were eager to leave the cold, cramped shelter, but uncertainty about their future cast a shadow over their relief. Margaret watched their faces and made a decision that surprised even her. "Mr. Morrison," she said quietly, drawing him aside. "What do you know about Cedar Falls?" "About the man I'm supposed to marry?" Morrison scratched his grizzled beard. "Thomas Henderson? Decent enough fellow, I suppose. Runs the general store. Been widowed about 2 years now. Lost his wife and baby to influenza. He's well respected in town, pays his bills, treats folks fair. He paused, studying her face. Why do you ask? Would he be the sort of man who might help children in need? Might depend on the circumstances. He's not unkind, but he's practical. Lost his own family, so he might not be eager to take on someone else's troubles. Morrison's eyes narrowed. You're not thinking what I think you're thinking, are you? Before Margaret could answer, little Tommy appeared at her side, tugging on her skirt. Miss Margaret, Emma won't eat her supper. She says her tummy hurts. Margaret knelt beside Emma, who was curled up near the fire looking pale and listless. When she felt the child's forehead, it was burning with fever. Emma's breathing was shallow and rapid, and when Margaret lifted her shirt to examine her, she found an angry red rash spreading across the girl's torso. Morrison, she called urgently, we have a problem. The driver took one look at Emma and swore under his breath. Scarlet fever, he said grimly. Seen it before. We need to get her to a doctor fast, or... He didn't finish the sentence, but his meaning was clear. Margaret gathered Emma into her arms, feeling the child's small body burning with fever. The nearest doctor was in Cedar Falls, still a day's travel away under good conditions. In the snow, with a sick child and 6 others to care for, the journey would be treacherous, but there was no choice. Emma's life hung in the balance, and Margaret would not lose her. Not after everything they'd all survived. As she held the feverish child close, listening to her labored breathing, Margaret realized that somewhere between finding these children and caring for them, her carefully planned future had transformed into something entirely different. She was no longer just a desperate woman seeking security through marriage. She had become something far more important. She had become their protector, their advocate, their hope. The wind outside had quieted to a whisper, as if the storm itself was holding its breath to see what would happen next. 7 children's lives hung in the balance, and Margaret Sullivan was the only thing standing between them and a world that had already failed them once. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new impossible choices, and a confrontation with a future she had never imagined. But tonight, she held a sick child in her arms and promised herself that whatever came next, she would not abandon these children the way the world had abandoned them. The fire crackled softly, casting dancing shadows on the shelter walls, and Margaret began to sing a lullaby her own mother had sung to her years ago, when the world had seemed safer and love had felt possible. Emma's breathing gradually slowed and deepened, and one by one, the other children joined in with voices that were stronger now, filled with something that hadn't been there when she'd found them. Hope. Dawn broke clear and bitter cold, the kind of crystalline morning that follows a plains blizzard. The world outside the shelter had been transformed into a pristine wasteland of snow that sparkled like crushed diamonds under the pale sun. But Margaret had no time to appreciate the beauty. Emma's condition had worsened during the night, and the child now lay unconscious in her arms, burning with fever. Morrison hitched the horses with grim efficiency, while Margaret worked to bundle the children for travel. She had torn her spare dress into strips to fashion makeshift scarves and mittens, using every piece of fabric she could spare. The older boys, Samuel and Ben, helped the younger ones prepare, their faces etched with worry as they glanced repeatedly at Emma's still form. "How far to Cedar Falls?" Margaret asked Morrison as he secured their meager supplies to the coach. 12 miles as the crow flies, but we ain't crows," he replied, his breath clouding in the frigid air. Roads buried under 3 feet of snow. In places, could take us 8 hours, maybe more. He paused, meeting her eyes. "That's if we don't get stuck or lose a wheel." Margaret looked down at Emma, whose breathing had become increasingly labored. 8 hours might be 8 hours too long. But staying in the shelter meant certain death for the child, and possibly for all of them when their food ran out. "We'll make it," she said with more confidence than she felt. The journey began as a test of endurance that quickly became a nightmare. The stagecoach, designed for established roads, struggled through snow that sometimes reached the axles. Morrison was forced to stop repeatedly to clear drifts or guide the horses around obstacles hidden beneath the white blanket. The children huddled together in the cramped interior, but despite their shared body heat, the cold seeped through every crack and crevice. 2 hours into the journey, disaster struck. The right rear wheel hit a concealed rock and snapped with a sound like gunfire. The coach lurched violently to one side, sending the children tumbling together in a heap. Samuel managed to catch Tommy before the little boy could hit his head, while Margaret clutched Emma protectively against her chest. Morrison's curses carried clearly through the thin air as he examined the damage. When Margaret climbed out to assess the situation, her heart sank. The wheel was beyond repair, its wooden spokes splintered beyond use. "Can we fix it?" she asked, though she already knew the answer from Morrison's expression. "Not with what we've got," he said, kicking at the broken wheel in frustration. "We're about 4 miles from Cedar Falls, but it might as well be 40 in this snow with a sick child." Margaret felt panic rising in her throat. 4 miles through deep snow would be manageable for healthy adults, but impossible for young children, especially with Emma unconscious and burning with fever. The temperature was dropping as the sun climbed higher and the wind was picking up again. "What about the horses?" Samuel asked, having climbed out to join them. Despite being only 15, he seemed to understand their dire situation better than any of the younger children. Morrison considered this. 2 horses, 8 people. We could maybe get 3 on each horse, but in this snow, with no saddles. He shook his head. Too dangerous. Horses would founder, and we'd all end up dead in a drift. Margaret stared across the endless expanse of white, her mind racing through impossible calculations. Then, through the brittle silence, came a sound that made her heart leap, the distant jingle of harness bells. "Someone's coming," she breathed. Morrison squinted into the distance, then grabbed his rifle from the coach. "Could be help," he said grimly, "but out here, you never know what kind of folks you might run into." The sound grew louder, and soon they could make out a dark shape moving across the snow. As it drew closer, Margaret could see it was a large sleigh pulled by 2 sturdy draft horses, with a single driver bundled in furs. Relief flooded through her as she recognized the purposeful way the sleigh moved. This was someone who knew the country and the conditions. The sleigh pulled up beside their disabled coach, and the driver pushed back his fur-lined hood to reveal a weathered face with kind blue eyes and a salt-and-pepper beard. He was perhaps 50 years old, with the solid build of a man accustomed to hard physical work. "Folks in trouble?" he asked, his voice carrying a slight German accent. "Broken wheel," Morrison replied, relaxing slightly but keeping his rifle visible. "Got a sick child, needs a doctor bad." The man's expression immediately grew serious. He climbed down from the sleigh with surprising agility and approached Margaret, who still held Emma in her arms. One look at the child's flushed face and labored breathing told him everything he needed to know. "I am Klaus Weber," he said, removing his thick gloves. "I have farmed 2 miles from Cedar Falls. This child has the fever, yes?" "Scarlet fever, we think," Margaret replied. "She needs medical attention immediately." Klaus nodded gravely. "Dr. Patterson is good doctor, but he is in Cedar Falls. We must get there quickly." He gestured toward his sleigh. "Is bigger than it looks. Can take all, I think." The next few minutes were a blur of activity as Klaus helped transfer everyone from the coach to his sleigh. The sleigh was indeed larger than it had appeared, designed for hauling supplies and equipment rather than passengers, but Klaus had thick buffalo robes and wool blankets that made it surprisingly comfortable. He arranged the children carefully, with the youngest ones nestled between the older ones for warmth, and Emma wrapped in his own fur-lined coat beside Margaret. "My horses are strong," Klaus assured them as he climbed back onto the driver's seat. "Know this country like their own stable. We will be in Cedar Falls before noon." As the sleigh began to move, Margaret marveled at the difference between this and the stagecoach. The runners glided smoothly over the snow, and Klaus's powerful draft horses moved with steady confidence through drifts that had defeated the stagecoach. The man clearly knew every landmark, every safe path through the treacherous terrain. "Are you married, Mr. Weber?" Margaret asked, partly to distract herself from Emma's worsening condition and partly from genuine curiosity about this good Samaritan, who had appeared when they needed him most. "Was married," Klaus replied, guiding the horses around a particularly deep drift. "My Greta died 3 years ago, influenza." His voice carried old grief, but no bitterness. "We had no children. Sometimes I think God saves the love we cannot give to our own families, so we can give it to others who need it." His words struck Margaret deeply. Here was a man who had suffered his own losses, but had chosen to respond with kindness rather than withdrawal from the world. She found herself wondering about her intended husband, Thomas Henderson. Would he show the same generous spirit when faced with 7 orphan children, one of them desperately ill? As they traveled, Klaus shared what he knew about Cedar Falls and its inhabitants. The town had grown rapidly in recent years due to the nearby railroad junction and fertile farming land. Thomas Henderson was indeed well respected, though Klaus noted that the man had become something of a recluse since losing his own family. "He is a good man," Klaus said carefully, "but grief changes people, sometimes makes them afraid to love again, yes?" The conversation was interrupted by a weak cry from Emma. The child's eyes fluttered open for the first time in hours, and she looked around in confusion. "Mama?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sleigh's runners. Margaret's heart clenched. "I'm here, sweetheart. You're safe." Emma's fevered gaze fixed on Margaret's face, and something shifted in her expression. Recognition, perhaps, or simply the desperate need for comfort that every sick child feels. "Don't leave me," Emma pleaded, her small hand gripping Margaret's with surprising strength. "Never," Margaret promised, and in that moment, she meant it with every fiber of her being. The outskirts of Cedar Falls appeared sooner than expected, marked by Klaus's own farm, a neat collection of buildings surrounded by snow-covered fields. The town itself was larger than Margaret had imagined, with perhaps 24 buildings lining a main street that showed signs of recent growth and prosperity. Klaus guided the sleigh directly to a modest white house with a painted sign reading, "Dr. Harold Patterson, physician." Before the sleigh had even stopped completely, a tall, thin man with prematurely gray hair emerged from the house, drawn by Klaus's urgent shouts. "What do we have?" Dr. Patterson asked, his professional manner taking over as he saw Emma's condition. "Scarlet fever," Margaret replied, carefully lifting the child from the sleigh. "She's been unconscious most of the night." Dr. Patterson nodded grimly and gestured toward his house. "Bring her inside immediately. The rest of you will need to wait outside until I can examine them for contagion." As Margaret carried Emma toward the doctor's house, she was aware of curious faces appearing in windows along the main street. Their arrival had not gone unnoticed, and she could only imagine what the townspeople were thinking about the strange woman with 7 children, appearing out of the aftermath of the blizzard. One of those curious observers, she knew, would be Thomas Henderson, the man she was supposed to marry, the man who expected a respectable bride to help him run his store and share his orderly life. Instead, he was about to meet a woman who had appointed herself guardian to 7 orphan children, one of them possibly dying of a contagious disease. As Dr. Patterson closed the door behind them, Margaret realized that her old life, the carefully planned, secure future she had traveled so far to claim, was about to collide with the new reality she had chosen. The outcome of that collision would determine not just her own fate, but the futures of 7 children who had no one else to depend on. Emma stirred in her arms, and Margaret whispered another promise into the child's burning ear. "Whatever happens, I won't let you down." Outside, the church bell began to toll noon, as if announcing that Margaret Sullivan's moment of truth had finally arrived. Inside Dr. Patterson's house, the air was thick with the smell of carbolic acid and medicinal herbs. Margaret sat in the doctor's parlor, still wearing her travel-stained clothes, while behind the closed door of his examination room, Dr. Patterson worked to save Emma's life. The other 6 children waited outside in Klaus Weber's sleigh, under Morrison's watchful eye, quarantined until the doctor could determine if they carried the contagion. Through the lace curtains, Margaret could see a small crowd gathering in the street. Word traveled fast in a town the size of Cedar Falls, and the arrival of a mysterious woman with 7 children had clearly become the day's most interesting event. She recognized the mix of curiosity and suspicion in their faces, the same look she'd grown accustomed to in Chicago after her family's financial ruin. The parlor door opened, and Dr. Patterson emerged, his sleeves rolled up and his face grave. He was younger than she'd expected, perhaps 35, with intelligent brown eyes and the steady hands of a man who'd seen his share of frontier medicine's harsh realities. "The child is very ill," he said without preamble. "It is indeed scarlet fever, and it's progressed further than I'd like. But she's young and appears to have been reasonably well nourished before this ordeal began." "That's in her favor. Will she live?" Margaret asked, her hands clenched so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had gone white. "Too early to say. The next 24 hours will tell us everything. I've given her medication to reduce the fever and ease her breathing, but the real battle is up to her now." Dr. Patterson studied Margaret's face carefully. "I understand you're not her mother?" "No," Margaret admitted. "I found her and the other children in a way station during the blizzard. They're all orphans." Double quotes. Dr. Patterson's eyebrows rose. "All 7 of them, and you've taken responsibility for them?" Before Margaret could answer, the sound of heavy footsteps on the front porch announced a new arrival. The door opened without a knock, and a man entered with the confidence of someone accustomed to being welcome wherever he went. Margaret knew immediately that this must be Thomas Henderson. He was not what she had expected. Her mental image had been of a soft, bookish shopkeeper, but the man who removed his hat and coat moved with the purposeful energy of someone used to physical work. He was perhaps 40 years old, tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair graying at the temples and deep-set hazel eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. His face bore the weathered lines of a man who'd known hardship, but there was no softness in his expression, only a careful neutrality that Margaret found impossible to read. "Miss Sullivan, I presume?" His voice carried no warmth, though it wasn't unkind. "I'm Thomas Henderson. I believe you were expected at my establishment yesterday." The formality of his greeting was like a slap in the face. This was not the reunion of a man eager to meet his bride, but the measured response of someone who'd already heard the story spreading through town and had come to assess the damage to his carefully ordered life. "Mr. Henderson," Margaret replied, rising from her chair, "I apologize for the delay. Circumstances, so I've heard." Thomas's gaze moved to Dr. Patterson, who was watching the exchange with obvious interest. "Doctor, I understand there's been some question about contagion?" "The child has scarlet fever," Dr. Patterson confirmed. "Miss Sullivan has been exposed, as have the other children. I'll need to examine them all before I can determine the extent of the risk." Thomas nodded slowly, his expression revealing nothing. "And these children are ... "Orphans," Margaret said, lifting her chin slightly. "I found them abandoned in a shelter during the storm. They would have died if someone hadn't helped them." "I see." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his eyes moving from Margaret to the window where the other children were visible in Klaus's sleigh. "And your intention is?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Margaret realized that Everything her future, the children's futures, perhaps even Emma's will to live, depended on how she answered. "My intention is to ensure they're cared for," she said carefully. "They have no one else." "That's admirable," Thomas replied, his tone still maddeningly neutral, but hardly practical. 7 orphan children represent a considerable responsibility. Food, clothing, shelter, education, the costs alone would be overwhelming for most people. Margaret felt heat rising in her cheeks. "Are you saying I should have left them to die?" "I'm saying that good intentions don't feed hungry mouths or cure sick children." Thomas moved to the window and looked out at the sleigh. "The boy who appears to be their leader, he looks old enough to work. The older girl as well. They might find placement with farming families who need extra hands. The younger ones ... double quotes, he shrugged. There's an orphanage in Omaha that takes children from the territories." "You're talking about separating them," Margaret said, her voice rising despite her efforts to remain calm. "They've been through enough without losing each other too." "Sometimes practicality matters more than sentiment," Thomas replied, turning back to face her. "This is the frontier, Miss Sullivan. Survival requires making hard choices." Dr. Patterson cleared his throat. Perhaps this conversation would be better continued elsewhere. "I have patients to attend to." Thomas nodded. "Of course, Miss Sullivan. Would you join me at my store? We have arrangements to discuss." The walk through Cedar Falls felt like a parade of shame. Margaret was acutely aware of the stares and whispered conversations that followed them down the main street. Thomas walked beside her in silence, his expression giving nothing away, while she struggled to formulate arguments for a case she wasn't sure could be won. Henderson's general store occupied a corner lot on Main Street, with large windows displaying an impressive array of goods. The interior was larger than she'd expected, with high ceilings and well-organized shelves stocked with everything from farm implements to bolts of cloth. A pot-bellied stove in the center of the store provided warmth, and several comfortable chairs suggested that the establishment served as something of a community gathering place. Thomas gestured toward a small office at the back of the store, where ledger books and papers covered a solid oak desk. The room was neat, organized, and completely impersonal like the man himself. Margaret was beginning to think. "Please sit," Thomas said, settling behind his desk and opening one of the ledgers. "I've been reviewing the financial arrangements we discussed in our correspondence." Margaret sat stiffly in the chair across from him, feeling like a debtor called to account. "Mr. Henderson, before we discuss business matters, I think we should address what's happened with these children." "On the contrary," Thomas replied, not looking up from his ledger. "The business matters are what will determine what's possible regarding the children." He finally met her eyes. "I agreed to marry you based on certain assumptions. A woman of good character who could assist with the store, maintain a household, and provide companionship. I did not agree to support 7 orphan children, one of whom may be carrying a deadly disease." "They're not just numbers in a ledger," Margaret said, her anger finally breaking through her careful control. "They're children who've lost everything, and everyone they ever loved. Samuel is 15 and has been keeping his brother and sister alive through sheer determination. Ben Murphy watched his entire family die of fever and still believes in the goodness of people. The twins barely speak because they're so traumatized, but they're brilliant children who could accomplish anything given the chance. And Emma ... Her voice broke slightly. "Emma is fighting for her life right now, and all she has in the world is the promise I made not to abandon her." Thomas leaned back in his chair, studying her face. For the first time since she'd met him, she thought she saw something flicker behind his carefully controlled expression. "You made her a promise," he said slowly. "Yes, without considering the consequences. Without knowing if you could keep it." Margaret lifted her chin. "Some promises are worth making, even when you don't know how you'll keep them." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming silently on the desk. Outside, the normal sounds of a frontier town went on horses' hooves on packed snow. The ring of the blacksmith's hammer, voices calling greetings across the street. "My wife made me a promise once," Thomas said finally, his voice so quiet Margaret had to lean forward to hear him. "When she was dying of influenza, with our baby already gone, she made me promise to find happiness again. To not let grief turn me into a bitter old man." He looked directly at Margaret. "I've been wondering for 2 years what keeping that promise might look like." Margaret held her breath, sensing that this moment was the fulcrum on which everything would turn. 7 orphan children is not what I had in mind," Thomas continued. "But perhaps keeping promises isn't supposed to be convenient." Before Margaret could respond, the sound of running footsteps on the wooden sidewalk outside caught their attention. The store's front door burst open, and Klaus Weber appeared, his face flushed with exertion and worry. "Mr. Henderson, Miss Sullivan," he called. "You must come quickly. The doctor, he says the little girl is asking for someone. She is awake, but double quotes." He paused, catching his breath. "She is asking for her mama." Margaret was already rising from her chair, but Thomas's voice stopped her. "Miss Sullivan," he said, and when she turned back, she saw something new in his expression, not warmth exactly, but a crack in the armor he'd built around his heart. "When we go to see about that child, we go together, as husband and wife should." Outside, the church bell began to toll again, but this time it sounded less like a warning and more like a celebration. Margaret felt tears stinging her eyes as she realized that sometimes the most important promises were the ones you never expected to make. "Together," she agreed, and meant it with her whole heart. The scene at Dr. Patterson's house was both heartbreaking and miraculous. Emma lay propped up on pillows in the doctor's small guest room, her fever finally broken, but her small face still pale as moonlight. When Margaret and Thomas entered together, the child's eyes immediately sought Margaret's face, with the desperate intensity of someone who had been afraid of being abandoned again. "Mama?" Emma whispered, using the word Margaret had heard from her in delirium, but which now carried the weight of conscious choice. Margaret felt her heart crack open. She moved to the bedside and took Emma's small hand in hers. "I'm here, sweetheart. I told you I wouldn't leave you. Are you really my mama now?" Emma asked, her voice gaining strength. "Not just pretend?" Margaret glanced at Thomas, who stood quietly by the door, his expression unreadable. But when their eyes met, he gave an almost imperceptible nod. "Yes," Margaret said firmly. "I'm really your mama now, and Mr. Henderson is going to be your papa. We're going to take care of you and all the other children." Emma's eyes widened as she took in Thomas's tall figure. "He looks strong," she observed with the frank assessment of a 6-year-old. "Can he fix things that are broken?" Thomas stepped closer to the bed, his usual formality softening. "I can try," he said quietly. "What kinds of things need fixing?" "Samuel's boots have holes, and Lucy cries at night because she misses her real mama and papa, and Tommy's afraid of the dark." Emma's list was delivered with the serious tone of someone reporting important business. "And I get scared sometimes that grown-ups will go away and not come back." Margaret watched Thomas's face as he absorbed this catalog of needs and fears. She saw him swallow hard, and when he spoke, his voice was gentler than she'd heard it before. "Well then," he said, settling carefully on the edge of the bed, "it sounds like we have our work cut out for us. But I think between your new mama and me, we can handle fixing boots and chasing away bad dreams. The other things might take a little longer, but we'll work on them together." Dr. Patterson appeared in the doorway, a slight smile on his face. "I hate to interrupt this family conference, but I have good news. Emma's fever has broken completely, and her breathing is much improved. I believe the worst is past." He looked at Thomas and Margaret. "However, she need careful nursing for the next few weeks, and the other children should be monitored closely for any signs of contagion. They'll all need homes, Thomas said practically. My house has 3 bedrooms, besides my own, but 7 children. 8, Dr. Patterson corrected gently. I examined the others while you were talking. They're all healthy, but they're also all staying. From what I observed, trying to separate them would be like tearing apart a family that's already formed. Margaret felt a surge of gratitude toward the doctor. 8 it is then. We'll make it work. Thomas rubbed his jaw thoughtfully. The house can be expanded. I own the lot next door as well. Klaus Weber is an excellent carpenter, and there are other men in town who'd help with construction. He paused, seeming to calculate costs in his head. It won't be cheap, but the store does well enough to support a large family if we're careful. The casual way he said large family made Margaret's chest tighten with emotion. This man who had seemed so cold and calculating just hours before was already making plans to accommodate 8 children he'd never expected to care for. There's more to consider than just housing, Dr. Patterson added. These children have been through significant trauma. They'll need time to adjust, to learn to trust that this stability is permanent. And they'll need education. Several of them can barely read. The schoolmistress, Mrs. Hartwell, is getting on in years, Thomas mused. She's been looking for someone to help with the younger students. Margaret, didn't you mention in your letters that you had some teaching experience? Margaret nodded, remembering the small school she'd helped run from their boarding house in Chicago before everything fell apart. I taught reading and arithmetic to the children of our boarders. I'd love to help with their education. Then it's settled, Thomas said, standing up from the bed. We'll have the wedding as soon as Emma is strong enough to attend. The children need the security of knowing their situation is permanent. And ... double quotes. He met Margaret's eyes. I find I'm looking forward to having a family again. The next 2 weeks passed in a whirlwind of activity that transformed not just Thomas's house, but the entire dynamic of Cedar Falls. The story of the mail-order bride who'd rescued 7 orphans had spread throughout the county, and the response was overwhelmingly positive. Women arrived daily with donations of clothing, blankets, and food. Men volunteered their time and skills to help with the house expansion. Klaus Weber proved to be a master carpenter, directing the construction of a new wing that would provide additional bedrooms and a larger kitchen. The work progressed with remarkable speed, aided by neighbors who seemed to view the project as a community effort rather than a private undertaking. Samuel Porter emerged as Klaus's eager apprentice, showing a natural aptitude for woodworking that surprised everyone, including himself. The boy threw himself into the physical labor with an intensity that Margaret recognized as his way of contributing to the family's security. Ben Murphy, with his Irish heritage of craftsmanship, proved equally skilled with tools and became Samuel's partner in many of the smaller projects. The twins, Lucy and Lillian, began to come out of their protective shell when Mrs. Hartwell arrived to assess their educational needs. The elderly schoolmistress was amazed to discover that despite their recent hardships, the girls had retained much of their parents' academic instruction and were actually advanced for their age in several subjects. They could be teaching the younger children within a year, Mrs. Hartwell confided to Margaret. Their parents did exceptional work with their education. Little Tommy Porter attached himself to Thomas with the single-minded devotion of a child who had been missing a father figure. The boy followed Thomas around the store, asking endless questions about the merchandise, the customers, and the business of running a shop. Thomas, who had initially seemed overwhelmed by the child's constant chatter, gradually began to appreciate Tommy's enthusiasm and quick mind. Mary Porter found her niche helping Margaret with the domestic arrangements. At 8, she was old enough to be genuinely helpful with cooking and cleaning, and she took fierce pride in her role as big sister to the younger children. Emma, still recovering but growing stronger each day, became the unofficial heart of their growing family. Her brush with death had somehow given her a wisdom beyond her years, and she seemed to instinctively know when one of the other children needed comfort or reassurance. The wedding was planned for the first Sunday in December, just 3 weeks after their arrival in Cedar Falls. Margaret had initially protested that such a short engagement was improper, but Thomas had gently pointed out that their circumstances were hardly conventional to begin with. "Besides," he said with the first real smile she'd seen from him, "I find I'm impatient to make this arrangement official. These children need to know they're secure, and frankly so do I." Margaret understood what he meant. The past weeks had been a revelation for both of them. She had discovered that beneath Thomas's practical exterior lay a man capable of deep kindness and unexpected humor. He had a gift for making each child feel special and valued, remembering their individual interests and concerns in ways that touched Margaret's heart. For his part, Thomas seemed amazed by Margaret's ability to create order and warmth from chaos. She had transformed his orderly but sterile house into a real home, filled with the sounds of children's laughter, the smells of fresh bread and stew, and the comfortable clutter of a family that was truly living rather than just existing. Night before the wedding, as Margaret tucked Emma into the small bed that had been placed in her room, the child asked a question that stopped her heart. "Will you still love us after you marry, Mr. Thomas? Some ladies only want their own children." Margaret sat on the edge of the bed and took Emma's small face in her hands. "Listen to me very carefully, Emma Collins, soon to be Henderson. You are my own children, all of you. Not because I gave birth to you, but because I chose you and you chose me. That's just as real and just as permanent as any other kind of family." Emma smiled, the first completely carefree smile Margaret had seen from her. "I'm glad the storm happened," she said sleepily. "If it didn't, we never would have found you." As Margaret watched Emma drift off to sleep, she reflected on the truth in those innocent words. The blizzard that had seemed like such a disaster had actually been the hand of fate, bringing together 8 souls who needed each other more than any of them had realized. Outside, snow was beginning to fall again, but this time it looked beautiful rather than threatening. Tomorrow she would marry a good man, and together they would give 7 orphan children the chance to become whoever they were meant to be. She thought of the woman who had left Chicago 3 weeks ago, desperate, alone, and resigned to a loveless marriage for the sake of security. That woman seemed like a stranger now. In her place was someone who had learned that love could grow in the most unexpected soil, and that sometimes the greatest adventures began with the simple decision to care for someone else more than yourself. The house settled around her, with the comfortable sounds of a family at rest. And Margaret Sullivan Henderson, for that's who she would be tomorrow, felt the deep satisfaction of knowing she was exactly where she belonged. 3 months into their marriage, Margaret Henderson thought she had finally found her rhythm. House expansion was complete. The children had settled into a routine of school and chores, and even Thomas seemed more relaxed than she'd ever seen him. But on a bitter February morning, their carefully constructed peace was shattered by an unexpected visitor. Margaret was teaching the younger children their letters at the kitchen table when she heard the sound of multiple horses approaching. Through the frost-covered window, she could see 3 men dismounting in front of the house, their official-looking uniforms immediately setting her on edge. The leader, a tall man with a stern face and a silver badge, knocked on the door with the kind of authority that demanded immediate attention. "Mrs. Henderson?" the man asked when Margaret opened the door. "I'm Marshal William Garrett from the Territorial Court in Rapid City. I need to speak with you about the children in your care." Margaret's blood turned to ice. "What about them?" "May I come in? This is a matter that requires some discussion." Against her better judgment, Margaret stepped aside to let the marshal enter. The children, sensing trouble, had gone silent around the kitchen table, their eyes wide with the kind of fear she'd hoped never to see in them again. "Marshal." Garrett removed his hat and surveyed the scene with professional detachment. "I've received a complaint regarding the custody of these children. Someone has questioned the legality of your guardianship and requested a formal investigation. A complaint from whom? Margaret asked, though she kept her voice steady for the children's sake. That information is confidential during the investigation process. However, I can tell you that serious questions have been raised about whether proper procedures were followed when you assumed responsibility for these minors. Samuel, now 16 and protective as a young wolf, stood up from the table. These are our procedures, he said firmly. Mrs. Henderson saved our lives. We chose to stay with her. Marshal Garrett's expression softened slightly as he looked at the boy. Son, I understand your loyalty, but the law requires certain formalities. When it comes to orphan children, there are procedures for placement, background investigations, financial assessments. We're not commodities to be placed. Then Murphy interjected, his Irish accent thickening with emotion. We're a family. That may be how you see it, the Marshal replied, but the territorial government has a responsibility to ensure that orphan children are properly cared for and educated according to established standards. Margaret felt the world tilting beneath her feet. What exactly are you saying, Marshal? I'm saying that a formal hearing has been scheduled for next week in Rapid City. You and your husband will need to appear before Judge Morrison to demonstrate that this arrangement is in the children's best interests. Until then, he paused, clearly uncomfortable with what he had to say next. The children will need to be placed in temporary custody with certified guardians. No, the word exploded from Emma, who had been silent until now. The little girl ran to Margaret and wrapped her arms around her waist. You promised you wouldn't leave us. I'm not leaving you, sweetheart, Margaret said, though her voice shook. This is just a misunderstanding that will clear up. Marshal Garrett's jaw was set in a grim line. Mrs. Henderson, I have families already approved by the court ready to take temporary custody. The Richardsons have agreed to take the 3 youngest children, and the Crawfords will take the 4 oldest. They're good people who know. Thomas's voice cut through the marshal's explanation like a blade. Margaret hadn't heard him come in, but he now stood in the doorway, his face a mask of controlled fury. You are not separating these children. Mr. Henderson, I understand your feelings, but this is a legal matter. The complaint alleges that you and your wife are unfit guardians, that the children are being used as unpaid labor, and that their education is being neglected. That's absurd. Thomas replied, These children are better fed, better housed, and better educated than half the families in this county. Samuel is learning a valuable trade. The twins are advanced beyond their grade level. Even little Tommy can read better than some adults. Nevertheless, the complaint has been filed, and the law requires investigation. Marshal Garrett gestured toward his deputies, who had remained silent by the door. I'm sorry, but the children need to come with us now. The chaos that followed would haunt Margaret for months afterward. Emma's screams as a deputy tried to pry her away from Margaret's side. Samuel's desperate attempt to shield his younger siblings behind his own body. The twins clinging to each other with such terror that both deputies hesitated to separate them. Little Tommy's confused tears as he called for his Papa Thomas to make the bad men go away, but it was Mary Porter's reaction that broke Margaret's heart completely. The 8-year-old simply shut down, her face going blank in a way that reminded Margaret horribly of how the child had looked when she'd first found them in the shelter, hollow-eyed and hopeless. Please, Margaret begged the marshal as his men began loading the children into wagons. Can't you see what this is doing to them? They've been through enough trauma. Mrs. Henderson, I have my orders. The hearing is scheduled for Friday. If you can prove your fitness as guardians, the children will be returned to you. He paused, his official demeanor cracking slightly. For what it's worth, I can see that they love you. But love isn't always enough in the eyes of the law. As the wagons pulled away, Margaret caught a glimpse of Emma's face pressed against the back window, tears streaming down her cheeks as she mouthed the word "Mama" over and over again. Thomas's arm went around Margaret's shoulders, but she barely felt it. The silence left behind by the children's absence was deafening. "Who would do this?" Margaret whispered. "Who would want to destroy what we've built?" Thomas's face was granite. "I have my suspicions, but right now we need to focus on the hearing. We need a lawyer, and we need to gather evidence that we're fit parents." The next few days passed in a blur of frantic preparation. Klaus Weber provided testimony about the children's living conditions and their obvious happiness before the marshal's visit. Mrs. Hartwell wrote a detailed letter about their educational progress. Dr. Patterson documented their excellent health and the improvements in their emotional state since joining the Henderson family. But even as they gathered support from the community, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that they were fighting against something larger than legal procedure. The complaint felt personal, targeted, designed to cause maximum damage to their family. The answer came on Thursday, the day before the hearing, when Thomas returned from a trip to Rapid City with a newspaper in his hand and rage in his eyes. "Look at this," he said, spreading the paper on their kitchen table. The headline read, "Mail Order Bride Operates Illegal Orphanage." The article, written by someone identified only as a concerned citizen, painted their family as a fraudulent operation designed to exploit child labor for profit. It claimed that Margaret had deliberately sought out orphan children to use as unpaid workers in Thomas's store and household, and that the children were living in overcrowded, unsanitary conditions. "This is all lies," Margaret said, staring at the paper in disbelief. "How can they print such things without evidence?" "Because someone is paying them to," Thomas replied grimly. "And I think I know who." Before he could explain, a knock at the door interrupted them. This time, the visitor was Klaus Weber, and his face was troubled. "Thomas, Margaret," he said, as they let him in, "I have news that will not please you. I was in town today, and I heard talk. The man who filed the complaint against you, his name is Vincent Crawford." Margaret frowned. "That name sounds familiar." "It should," Klaus continued. "He is the brother of Rachel Crawford, one of the women who was supposed to take temporary custody of some of your children. But more important, he is also the man who has been trying to buy your store for the past year." The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. Vincent Crawford was a businessman from Omaha who had been pressuring Thomas to sell his profitable store so Crawford could expand his own commercial interests into Cedar Falls. Thomas had refused every offer, and now Crawford had found a way to destroy Thomas's reputation and force him out of business. "He's using the children as weapons," Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's willing to traumatize 8 innocent children just to get what he wants. More than that," Thomas said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "He's counting on us being so destroyed by losing the children that we'll give up and leave town. Then he can buy the store from whoever takes it over." Klaus nodded grimly. "The man has much money and influence in Rapid City. The judge who will hear your case, Judge Morrison, he owes Crawford favors from past business dealings." Margaret felt despair settling over her like a heavy blanket. "Then we've already lost. How can we fight against that kind of corruption?" "We fight by telling the truth," Thomas said firmly. "And we fight by making sure everyone knows what kind of man Vincent Crawford really is." He looked at Klaus. "How? Many people in this county know our family personally. How many have seen the children happy and healthy in our care?" Klaus's weathered face broke into a slow smile. "Every person who helped build your house. Every woman who brought clothes and food for the children. Every man who worked alongside Samuel and Ben. Every child who plays with your little ones at church." He nodded decisively. "Tomorrow, my friend, you will not face that judge alone." As Klaus left to spread the word, Margaret allowed herself a small spark of hope. They were fighting for more than just their family now. They were fighting for The principle that love and dedication should matter more than money and influence. Outside, snow was beginning to fall again, but this time it didn't look threatening. It looked like a blessing, covering the world in clean white that reminded Margaret of new beginnings and second chances. Tomorrow would determine whether their family survived intact or was scattered to the winds by greed and corruption. But tonight, she and Thomas would prepare to fight for their children with everything they had, because some things were worth any risk, any sacrifice, any battle that needed to be fought. The courthouse in Rapid City was an imposing brick building that seemed designed to intimidate anyone who dared challenge the system. Margaret clutched Thomas's arm as they climbed the steps, her stomach churning with anxiety. Behind them came a procession that had grown throughout their journey: Klaus Weber and his wife Ingrid, Mrs. Hartwell, despite her advanced age, Dr. Patterson, who had closed his practice for the day, and nearly 30 other residents of Cedar Falls who had traveled through bitter cold to support their cause. Vincent Crawford was already inside, a well-dressed man in his 50s with silver hair and the kind of polished confidence that came from never having been told no. He was surrounded by 3 lawyers in expensive suits, and Margaret felt her heart sink at the display of legal firepower arrayed against them. "Mrs. Henderson," a gentle voice said behind her. Margaret turned to see a young woman with kind eyes and calloused hands. "I'm Sarah Richardson. My husband and we were asked to take some of your children temporarily." Margaret tensed, expecting hostility, but Sarah continued quickly. "I wanted you to know that we refused. What those children have been through these past 3 days... She shook her head. "It's criminal. Little Emma hasn't spoken a word since. They brought her to us. She just sits by the window waiting." "How are they?" Margaret asked desperately. "All of them?" "Heartbroken," Sarah replied simply. "Samuel tried to escape twice to get back to his siblings. The twins won't eat. Tommy keeps asking when his Papa Thomas is coming to get him." Her voice hardened. "Whatever Mr. Crawford promised us to participate in this charade, it wasn't worth seeing children suffer." Margaret felt tears threatening, but Thomas's steady presence beside her gave her strength. "Thank you for telling us," she managed. Inside the courtroom, Judge Morrison presided from behind an imposing oak bench. He was an older man with white whiskers and sharp eyes that seemed to miss nothing. As the proceedings began, Margaret tried to read his expression, looking for any sign of bias or predetermined judgment. Crawford's lead attorney, a slick man named Pemberton, opened with a devastating attack on Margaret and Thomas's fitness as guardians. He painted a picture of an impulsive woman who had taken on responsibilities far beyond her capabilities, supported by a man more interested in free labor than child welfare. "Your Honor," Pemberton declared, "these children were essentially kidnapped from their rightful path through proper territorial custody procedures. Mrs. Henderson, by her own admission, had no legal authority to assume guardianship. She acted purely on emotion, without consideration for the children's long-term welfare or educational needs." He presented documents showing that proper orphanages existed in Omaha, with trained staff and established educational programs. He questioned Thomas's financial ability to support 8 children, suggesting that the children were being used as unpaid workers in his store. Margaret watched the judge's face during this presentation, her heart sinking as she saw him nod at several points. When Pemberton finished, the case against them seemed overwhelming. Then it was their turn. They had managed to hire a local lawyer, William Foster, a young man fresh from law school who had taken their case more from idealism than experience. Margaret worried that his youth and inexperience would be no match for Crawford's legal team, but Foster surprised everyone, including Margaret, with his passionate opening statement. "Your Honor, this case isn't really about legal procedures or territorial custody laws. It's about whether we believe that love, dedication, and community support matter more than bureaucratic paperwork." It's about whether we're going to tear apart a family that has not only survived together, but thrived together. Foster called Klaus Weber as his first witness. The German farmer's testimony was simple but powerful. He described the house building project, how the entire community had rallied to support the Henderson family, and the obvious happiness and health of the children before their forced removal. "I have 6 children of my own," Klaus said in his accented English. "I know what happy children look like, and I know what traumatized children look like. Before this court action, the Henderson children were the happiest I have ever seen. Now." He shook his head sadly. Mrs. Hartwell followed, her testimony about the children's educational progress particularly compelling. She brought samples of their schoolwork, showing how the twins had advanced 2 grade levels in just a few months, and how even little Tommy was reading at an advanced level for his age. "In 40 years of teaching," Mrs. Hartwell declared, "I have never seen children flourish as these have under the Hendersons' care. To suggest that their education is being neglected is not just wrong, it's absurd." Dr. Patterson's medical testimony painted a picture of children who had arrived, malnourished and traumatized, but had gained weight, grown stronger, and shown remarkable psychological recovery under Margaret and Thomas's care. But it was Samuel Porter's testimony that truly turned the tide. Foster had requested permission for the boy to speak on behalf of himself and his siblings, and Judge Morrison had agreed. Samuel, now 17 and tall for his age, approached the witness stand with the dignity of someone far older. His voice was clear and strong as he spoke. "Your Honor, I've been taking care of my brother and sister since I was 14 years old. I know what it means to be responsible for other people's lives. When Mrs. Henderson found us in that shelter, we were dying, not just from cold and hunger, but from hopelessness." He turned to look directly at Crawford, his young face filled with quiet intensity. "This man wants to separate us because it serves his business interests. He doesn't care about our welfare or our education. He cares about money. Mrs. Henderson and Mr. Thomas cared about us when no one else did." Samuel's voice grew stronger. "I can read and write now. I'm learning carpentry. I have a future because someone believed I was worth investing in. My brother Tommy isn't afraid of the dark anymore because he knows Papa Thomas will protect him." Emma laughs now, really laughs, because she knows Mama Margaret will never leave her. The young man's composure finally cracked slightly. "Please don't make us go back to being afraid. Please don't make us go back to believing that no one cares if we live or die." The courtroom was completely silent as Samuel returned to his seat. Margaret saw several people in the gallery wiping their eyes, and even Judge Morrison seemed affected by the boy's words, but Crawford's attorney wasn't finished. Pemberton rose for cross-examination, clearly intending to discredit Samuel's testimony. "Young man," he began condescendingly, "isn't it true that you and the other children work in Mr. Henderson's store without pay?" "I help in the store," Samuel replied calmly, "the same way any son helps his father's business." "But you're not actually Mr. Henderson's son, are you?" "Yes, I am," Samuel said firmly. "Maybe not by blood, but in every way that matters." Pemberton pressed harder. "Isn't it true that you were forced to help with construction work on the house?" "I chose to help build our home," Samuel replied. "Klaus Weber taught me carpentry skills that will serve me my whole life. How is that exploitation?" Foster objected to the aggressive questioning, but Samuel held his ground with remarkable composure for someone his age. When Pemberton finally gave up, it was clear that his cross-examination had backfired. The surprise came when Judge Morrison announced that he wanted to hear from Vincent Crawford himself. This was unusual in a custody hearing, but the judge clearly had questions about the man behind the complaint. Crawford took the stand with confidence, but that confidence began to crack under Foster's questioning. The young lawyer had done his homework, revealing Crawford's multiple attempts to buy Thomas's store, his business dealings with questionable partners, and his reputation for using legal harassment to achieve business goals. Mr. Crawford, Foster asked, "Isn't it true that you offered to withdraw this complaint if Mr. Henderson agreed to sell you his store?" "That's a lie," Crawford replied, but his voice lacked conviction. Foster produced a letter, written in Crawford's own hand, making exactly such an offer. The courtroom erupted in murmurs as the true motivation behind the complaint became clear. Judge Morrison called for order, his face dark with anger. "Mr. Crawford, are you telling this court that you filed a complaint regarding child welfare as a business negotiation tactic?" Crawford's lawyers were on their feet, objecting and trying to protect their client, but the damage was done. The judge had seen enough, but the final blow came from an unexpected source. Sarah Richardson, the woman who had been asked to take temporary custody of some of the children, rose from the gallery and asked permission to address the court. "Your Honor," she said, "I need to tell you what I've witnessed these past 3 days. Those children are dying inside without their parents. Emma Henderson hasn't eaten a full meal since she was brought to us. She sits by the window from dawn to dusk, waiting for her mother to come back. Tommy cries himself to sleep every night calling for his Papa Thomas." Sarah's voice grew stronger. "My husband and I have 4 children of our own. We know what family looks like, and we know what love looks like. What Margaret and Thomas Henderson have built with these children is the most beautiful family I've ever seen. To destroy it for the sake of business profit would be a crime against everything we claim to value in this territory." When she finished, the courtroom was completely silent except for the sound of muffled sobbing from several people in the gallery. Judge Morrison sat quietly for a long moment, staring at the papers before him. Finally he looked up, his expression grave. "I've heard enough," he said. "This court will recess for 1 hour while I consider my decision." As people filed out of the courtroom, Margaret felt both hope and terror warring in her chest. They had presented their case as well as possible, but the judge's decision would determine whether their family lived or died. Outside the courthouse, snow was falling again, and Margaret found herself thinking of that first blizzard that had brought them all together. Sometimes, she reflected, the storms that seemed most threatening were actually the ones that led to the greatest blessings. In 1 hour, they would know if their family would survive intact, or if love and community could triumph over greed and corruption. The battle for their children's future and their own was about to reach its climax. The hour of recess felt like an eternity. Margaret and Thomas walked the snowy streets of Rapid City in silence, neither trusting themselves to speak about what might come. The supporters from Cedar Falls had gathered in the hotel lobby, their worried conversations creating a low hum of anxiety that matched Margaret's internal turmoil. When they returned to the courthouse, Judge Morrison's expression was unreadable. He surveyed the packed courtroom with stern eyes before beginning to speak, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "In my 23 years on the bench," he began, "I have rarely encountered a case that so clearly illustrates the difference between the letter of the law and the spirit of justice. Mr. Crawford, your complaint has been thoroughly investigated, and I find it to be not only baseless but malicious." Crawford's face flushed red, but his lawyers restrained him from speaking. Judge Morrison continued, "The evidence presented shows that the Henderson children are thriving physically, emotionally, and educationally under their current guardianship. More importantly, this court has been presented with clear evidence that the complaint was filed not out of concern for child welfare, but as a business intimidation tactic." The judge's voice grew harder. "Mr. Crawford, I am dismissing your complaint with prejudice and referring your conduct to the Territorial Attorney General's Office for investigation of potential criminal charges related to abuse of legal process." The courtroom erupted in cheers, but Judge Morrison wasn't finished. "However," he said, raising his hand for silence, "this case has revealed legitimate concerns about territorial custody procedures that must be addressed. While the Henderson family will be immediately reunited, I am ordering a comprehensive review of how we handle orphan children in this territory." Margaret felt simultaneous relief and dread. They had won, but the judge's words suggested there might still be complications ahead. "Mrs. Henderson," Judge Morrison addressed her directly, "your actions, while motivated by compassion, did circumvent established legal procedures. I am therefore ordering that you and your husband complete formal adoption proceedings for all 8 children within 60 days. This will provide legal protection for your family and ensure that no future challenges can be mounted against your guardianship." Margaret nodded eagerly. Legal adoption had always been their intention, but the crisis had prevented them from pursuing it through proper channels. "Furthermore," the judge continued, "I am appointing Dr. Patterson as territorial advisor on orphan welfare, with Mrs. Hartwell serving as educational consultant. Together, they will develop new protocols that prioritize the best interests of children while maintaining necessary legal safeguards." As the gavel fell, the courtroom exploded in celebration. Margaret found herself surrounded by tearful embraces from the Cedar Falls delegation, but all she could think about was seeing the children again. The reunion took place in the hotel where the children had been staying with their temporary guardians. Margaret's heart nearly broke when she saw them lined up in the lobby, their faces a mixture of hope and fear, as if they weren't quite sure this was real. Emma was the first to break ranks, running across the lobby and launching herself into Margaret's arms with such force that they both nearly fell over. "Mama, you came back. You really came back." The dam burst then, and all 8 children surrounded Margaret and Thomas in a tangle of arms and tears and laughter. Tommy clung to Thomas's leg, repeating, "Papa Thomas," over and over, like a prayer of thanksgiving. Samuel, trying to maintain his teenage dignity, finally gave up and joined the group embrace, his shoulders shaking with relief. But it was Mary Porter who provided the moment that would stay with Margaret forever. The quiet 8-year-old, who had shut down so completely during the separation, looked up at Margaret with solemn eyes and said, "I knew you'd come back. Real mothers always come back." The journey home to Cedar Falls was triumphant, with Klaus Weber's sleigh expanded to accommodate everyone and additional supporters traveling alongside. But as they approached their town, Margaret realized their ordeal had changed more than just their family. It had galvanized the entire community. Main Street was lined with people despite the cold, holding lanterns and torches in the growing dusk. A banner stretched across the street reading, "Welcome home, Henderson family." Mrs. Patterson had organized the women of the town to prepare a feast in the church hall, while the men had worked to add finishing touches to the house that made it even more beautiful than when they'd left. Over the following weeks, as they worked through the adoption proceedings, Margaret marveled at how their crisis had strengthened not just their family bonds, but their connection to the community. The legal battle had forced everyone in Cedar Falls to examine what they truly valued, and the answer had been overwhelmingly clear: love and commitment mattered more than bureaucracy and profit. The adoption hearing was a joyful contrast to the custody battle. Judge Morrison traveled to Cedar Falls personally to oversee the proceedings, stating that after witnessing their fight for the children, he wanted to be part of making their family legally secure. Each child was asked individually if they consented to the adoption, and their responses ranged from Emma's enthusiastic, "Yes, forever and always," to Samuel's more dignified but equally heartfelt, "It would be an honor to be Thomas and Margaret Henderson's son." But the real surprise came when Dr. Patterson approached them after the ceremony with unexpected news. "Margaret Thomas," he said, "I've been corresponding with territorial officials about the orphan welfare reforms Judge Morrison ordered. They want to establish Cedar Falls as a model community for child placement, with your family as an example of how the system should work." Thomas frowned. "What does that mean exactly?" "It means funding. Dr. Patterson explained. Territorial support for housing, education, and care of orphan children. But more than that, it means other families, like yours, could receive official recognition and support instead of facing legal challenges. Margaret felt a familiar stirring of purpose. Are you saying there are other children who need homes? Always. Dr. Patterson replied. The question is whether Cedar Falls is ready to become a community that actively seeks to help them, instead of just hoping someone else will handle the problem. Over the following months, Margaret and Thomas found themselves at the center of a quiet revolution in how their territory approached child welfare. Their house became an unofficial headquarters for what townspeople began calling the Cedar Falls model, a community-based approach to orphan care that emphasized keeping siblings together, providing education and job training, and ensuring that love rather than mere survival was the foundation of placement decisions. The first test came in spring, when word reached them of another group of orphaned children, 4 siblings, whose parents had died in a mine collapse near Deadwood. The territorial officials wanted to separate the children and send them to different institutions, but the Cedar Falls community rallied to find them a home together. Klaus Weber and his wife Ingrid, inspired by the Henderson family's example, volunteered to take the siblings. The entire town participated in expanding the Weber house and ensuring the children's transition was as smooth as possible. By summer, 3 more families in Cedar Falls had been officially certified as adoption families, and their success stories were being shared across the territory. Margaret found herself traveling to other communities, sharing their experiences and helping establish similar programs. But perhaps the most significant change was in the children themselves. Samuel, now 18, had become Klaus Weber's business partner, establishing a carpentry shop that trained other young men in the trade. Ben Murphy's natural charm and intelligence had led to his appointment as an assistant teacher, working with Mrs. Hartwell to develop new educational programs. Twins, Lucy and Lillian, had surprised everyone by revealing artistic talents that flourished once they felt secure. Their paintings and drawings decorated the schoolhouse and several businesses in town, and they had begun teaching art classes to younger children. Little Tommy, no longer quite so little at 7, had become the town's unofficial ambassador, greeting visitors with the kind of infectious enthusiasm that only a completely secure and loved child could possess. Mary Porter had grown into her role as big sister not just to her own siblings, but to every child in town who needed guidance or comfort. And Emma Sweet, Emma, who had nearly died in that blizzard shelter, had become the living symbol of what love could accomplish. At 8 years old, she possessed a wisdom and compassion that drew people to her like a magnet. Her laughter could be heard throughout the Henderson house, and her favorite phrase had become, "Our family keeps growing." Margaret often found herself reflecting on the woman who had stepped off that stagecoach barely a year earlier. That desperate, frightened person seemed like a stranger now. In trying to save 8 orphaned children, she had discovered something she hadn't even known she was looking for: her own purpose and her own capacity for love that extended far beyond what she had ever imagined possible. The challenges weren't over. There would always be more children who needed homes, more legal battles to fight, more prejudices to overcome. But Margaret had learned something powerful during their journey. When a community decides to act with love instead of fear, when people choose cooperation over competition, almost any obstacle can be overcome. As autumn approached, and the first anniversary of their meeting drew near, Margaret stood in her kitchen, expanded now to accommodate not just their own large family, but the frequent visitors who came to see how the Cedar Falls model worked in practice. Through the window, she could see Samuel and Ben working in the carpentry shop, the twins painting at easels in the garden, and Thomas teaching Tommy and Emma how to properly stack merchandise in the store. It was everything she had never dared to dream, built from the ashes of what had seemed like the worst catastrophe imaginable. Sometimes, Margaret reflected, The most beautiful families were the ones that chose each other against all odds and refused to let anything tear them apart. 2. Years after the courthouse victory, Margaret Henderson faced a challenge she had never anticipated. The success of the Cedar Falls model had brought unexpected attention from the territorial government, but not all of it was welcome. On a crisp October morning, she stood in her expanded kitchen, staring at an official letter that threatened to unravel everything they had built. The letter was from the new territorial governor, Harrison Blackwell, announcing his intention to visit Cedar Falls to personally evaluate their orphan placement program. On the surface, this seemed like recognition of their success. But Margaret knew better. Governor Blackwell was a political appointee from back east, a man who had campaigned on promises to bring order and efficiency to what he called the chaotic frontier approach to social problems. "He wants to shut us down," Thomas said grimly, reading over her shoulder. "Replace the Cedar Falls model with a centralized institution system." Margaret nodded, her stomach churning. They had heard rumors that Blackwell favored large, state-run orphanages where children could be processed efficiently and prepared for industrial work in the growing eastern cities. The idea of loving families choosing each other was, in his view, too unpredictable and difficult to regulate. "When is he coming?" Emma asked, now 10 years old and sharp enough to understand the gravity of adult conversations. 3 weeks, Margaret replied, trying to keep the worry out of her voice. "He's bringing a team of officials to conduct what they're calling a comprehensive evaluation." Samuel, now 20 and fully grown into his role as the family's unofficial leader among the children, set down his coffee cup with determination. "Then we'll show them what family really looks like. All of us together." But the challenge proved more complex than simple demonstration. Over the next few days, disturbing reports reached Cedar Falls from other communities that had implemented similar programs. Governor Blackwell's evaluations had been thorough and devastating. Families had been separated, children relocated to distant institutions, and local programs disbanded in favor of centralized control. The news created a wave of panic among the families who had opened their homes to orphan children. The Webbers, who had successfully adopted their 4 siblings, received visits from territorial inspectors, questioning everything from their German accents to their farming methods. Other families began to worry that their love and dedication would be deemed insufficient by bureaucratic standards. Margaret found herself in the unexpected position of having to hold the community together while facing her own fears. The woman who had once been desperate enough to accept a mail-order marriage for security now carried the hopes and dreams of dozens of families on her shoulders. The crisis deepened when they learned that Vincent Crawford, despite his legal defeat, had been corresponding with Governor Blackwell's office. The businessman had apparently reinvented himself as a child welfare expert, proposing a large institutional facility near Rapid City that would coincidentally require purchasing significant amounts of supplies from his various business ventures. "He's using the children again," Margaret said during an emergency meeting at the church. Representatives from every family involved in the program had gathered to discuss their response to the governor's visit. Just like before, but on a larger scale. Klaus Weber, his face weathered by years of honest work, but his eyes still bright with determination, stood to address the group. "My friends, we have faced challenges before. Margaret and Thomas, they showed us that love is stronger than law. That community is stronger than bureaucracy. We cannot let fear make us forget what we have learned." Mrs. Hartwell, now in her 70s but still sharp as a tack, raised her hand. "I've been teaching children for 45 years. I've seen what institutions do to young minds and hearts. They may be efficient, but they produce broken adults. What we've built here creates whole human beings." Dr. Patterson added his medical perspective. "The health improvements I've documented in our children are remarkable. Not just physical health, but emotional and psychological wellness that simply cannot be achieved in institutional settings. But it was Ben Murphy, now 22 and serving as an assistant teacher, who provided the most compelling argument. Governor Blackwell doesn't understand what we've built here because he's never seen anything like it. Most politicians think in terms of systems and efficiency. We need to show him that what we have isn't chaos, it's a different kind of order. An order based on love instead of control. Margaret felt a spark of inspiration. What if we don't just defend what we have? What if we challenge them to do better? Over the following weeks, the community organized what they privately called Operation Family. Instead of simply preparing to defend their program, they decided to demonstrate its superiority by inviting comparison with traditional institutional approaches. Samuel coordinated with other young adults who had grown up in the system, gathering testimonials and documentation of their achievements. The contrast was striking. While institutional children typically left the system at 16 with minimal education and few prospects, the Cedar Falls children were becoming teachers, craftsmen, artists, and business owners. The twins, Lucy and Lillian, now 14 and accomplished artists, created a visual presentation showing the difference between institutional dormitories and family homes. Their paintings captured not just the physical differences, but the emotional atmosphere, the warmth and laughter of families versus the sterile uniformity of institutions. Tommy, now 9 and blessed with his father's business acumen, surprised everyone by conducting his own research project. He had written letters to children in various institutional settings, comparing their daily experiences with those of the Cedar Falls children. His findings, presented in careful 9-year-old handwriting, were devastating to the institutional model. Mary Porter, now 12 and wise beyond her years, organized the younger children in the community to create what she called a living demonstration. Every child who had been placed through the Cedar Falls model would participate in showing their daily lives, their education, their relationships, and their dreams for the future. Emma, with her gift for touching hearts, prepared something special. She had written a letter to Governor Blackwell, not as a child asking for mercy, but as a young person who had experienced both abandonment and love, explaining what family meant to someone who had lived without it. But perhaps the most powerful preparation came from an unexpected source. Margaret received a visit from Sarah Richardson, the woman who had refused to participate in Crawford's scheme and had testified on their behalf during the court hearing. "Margaret," Sarah said, "I've been thinking about what you all have accomplished here, and I believe I understand something that even you might not fully realize." "What's that?" Margaret asked, settling them both at her kitchen table with cups of coffee. "You haven't just created a better way to place orphan children. You've created a model for how communities can solve problems that governments can't. You've shown that when people choose to care for each other, they can accomplish things that no amount of bureaucracy or funding can achieve." Sarah leaned forward earnestly. "Governor Blackwell isn't just evaluating an orphan placement program. He's evaluating whether communities can govern themselves more effectively than distant authorities. That's why he's so determined to shut you down, not because your program doesn't work, but because it works too well." Margaret felt the truth of those words settling in her chest. Their success was indeed a challenge to the conventional wisdom that social problems required government solutions implemented by professional experts. "So what do?" Margaret asked. "We show him that community solutions aren't just more effective, they're more sustainable, more adaptable, and more humane than institutional approaches. We show him that the choice isn't between efficiency and chaos, but between control and empowerment." As the day of Governor Blackwell's arrival approached, Margaret found herself reflecting on her own transformation. The frightened woman who had stepped off the stagecoach 3 years earlier could never have imagined leading a community movement or challenging territorial policy. But every step of her journey, from finding the children in the blizzard shelter to fighting for them in court, to building a new model of family and community, had prepared her for this moment. The night before the governor's visit, the Henderson family gathered in their living room for their customary evening time together. Thomas read aloud from a book while the children worked on various projects around the room. Emma practiced her letter to the governor. Samuel reviewed his business plans for expanding the carpentry workshop, and the twins added finishing touches to their presentation materials. "Are you nervous, Mama?" Tommy asked, looking up from the arithmetic problems he was solving. Margaret considered the question seriously. "A little," she admitted, "but I'm not afraid. We know what we've built here is good and right. Tomorrow we just need to help other people see it too." "And if they don't?" Mary asked quietly. Margaret looked around the room at the faces of her children, some biological in her heart, if not her blood, all of them chosen and cherished. She thought of the other families in Cedar Falls who had taken similar journeys, of the children who had found homes and hope, of the community that had learned to solve problems through love rather than law. "Then we keep doing what we know is right," she said firmly. "We keep choosing love over fear, community over bureaucracy, and hope over despair. Because some things are too important to abandon just because they're difficult to defend." Outside, the wind was picking up, promising another early winter storm. But inside the Henderson house, surrounded by the warmth of chosen family and strengthened by years of facing challenges together, Margaret felt ready for whatever tomorrow might bring. The battle for the future of the Cedar Falls model, and for the principle that love could triumph over institutional indifference, was about to begin. Governor Harrison Blackwell arrived in Cedar Falls on a gray November morning, his entourage of territorial officials and bureaucrats filling 3 carriages. He was a tall, austere man in his 50s, dressed in an expensive Eastern suit that seemed out of place against the frontier backdrop. His pale eyes surveyed the town with the calculating gaze of someone accustomed to finding fault. Margaret stood with Thomas and the children in front of their house, part of a reception committee that included virtually every family in Cedar Falls. She felt the weight of history in this moment, not just their family's history, but the future of every orphaned child in the territory. "Mrs. Henderson," Governor Blackwell said, his voice carrying the clipped accent of Boston privilege, "I've read the reports about your experiment here. I'm curious to see how it functions in practice." "Governor," Margaret replied, her voice steady despite the butterflies in her stomach. "Welcome to Cedar Falls. We're honored to show you what we've accomplished together." What followed was the most important day in the history of their small community. The governor's inspection was thorough and methodical, but the Cedar Falls families were ready for him. At the schoolhouse, Mrs. Hartwell presented educational assessment scores that showed their children performing significantly above territorial averages. The twins, Lucy and Lillian, displayed their artwork while explaining how their education included not just academic subjects but creative expression that would have been impossible in institutional settings. Ben Murphy, now serving as head teacher for the older students, demonstrated the advanced curriculum they had developed, which combined traditional academics with practical skills training. Samuel showed the governor through the carpentry workshop where several young men from different families worked together, learning trades that would support them throughout their lives. But it was the children themselves who provided the most compelling testimony. Tommy, now 10 and articulate beyond his years, gave the governor a tour of the general store, explaining how he was learning business principles while still maintaining a normal childhood. Mary Porter, 13 and possessed of quiet wisdom, spoke about the importance of keeping siblings together and how the security of family had allowed all of them to flourish. Emma, now 11 and radiating the confidence of a child who had never doubted her place in the world, presented her letter to the governor with the poise of someone far older. "Governor Blackwell," she read aloud, "I was dying when Mama Margaret found me in that shelter. Not just from the fever, but from believing that nobody cared if children like us lived or died. She didn't save just my life, she saved my hope. In your institutions, children survive. In families like ours, children thrive. There's a difference, and it matters. The governor listened to Emma's words with an unreadable expression, but Margaret caught something flickering in his eyes, perhaps a memory of his own childhood, or recognition of a truth he had tried to bury beneath bureaucratic efficiency. The afternoon brought the moment Margaret had been dreading most, the governor's meeting with Vincent Crawford, who had arrived that morning with his own presentation about the benefits of centralized institutional care. Crawford had changed little in the 3 years since their court battle. He was still polished, still persuasive, still driven by profit, disguised as public service. His proposal for a territorial orphanage was impressive on paper, a large facility that could house hundreds of children, with standardized education and preparation for industrial employment. "Governor," Crawford said, gesturing to architectural drawings and budget projections, "what you see in Cedar Falls may be heartwarming, but it's not sustainable or scalable. We cannot rely on the random kindness of frontier families to solve the territory's orphan problem. We need professional management, standardized procedures, and economies of scale." Governor Blackwell nodded thoughtfully. "Your proposal does address the efficiency concerns I've raised. How do you respond to the claims that institutional children show poorer outcomes in adulthood?" Crawford waved dismissively. "Sentiment. Governor, the role of territorial institutions is to prepare children for productive citizenship, not to coddle them with false familial attachments. These Cedar Falls children may seem happy now, but they're being prepared for disappointment when they discover the real world doesn't function like their artificial families." Margaret felt anger rising in her chest, but before she could respond, Samuel stepped forward. At 21, he had grown into a man of quiet authority, and his voice carried the weight of lived experience. "Mr. Crawford," Samuel said calmly, "I am the real world. I run a successful business, employ 3 people, and am married to a wonderful woman who was also raised in a loving adoptive family. My brother Tommy is preparing for the Territorial University. My sisters are accomplished artists and scholars. We are not disappointed by reality, we are equipped to shape it." Samuel turned to address Governor Blackwell directly. "Sir, Mr. Crawford's institution model assumes that children are problems to be managed rather than people to be empowered. The Cedar Falls model doesn't just place children in homes, it creates communities that invest in their potential." The governor was quiet for a long moment, studying Samuel's face. "Young man, what would you say to critics who argue that your success is an exception rather than the rule?" "I would say, Governor, that exceptions become rules when communities decide to make them so," Samuel replied. 3 years ago, we were 7 desperate children hiding in a shelter, waiting to die. Today, we are productive citizens contributing to our community's growth and prosperity. The only difference is that people chose to believe in us." The turning point came that evening during a community dinner held in the church hall. Every family that had participated in the Cedar Falls model was present, along with the children they had welcomed into their homes. The governor found himself surrounded not by statistics or policy papers, but by living proof of what love and commitment could accomplish. He spoke with Klaus Weber about the economic benefits of training young craftsmen locally rather than sending them to distant cities. He listened to Dr. Patterson's medical data, showing improved health outcomes for children in family settings. He observed the natural interactions between adopted and biological children, seeing how the program had strengthened rather than strained the community's social fabric. But the moment that changed everything came when Governor Blackwell was introduced to a young woman named Catherine Morrison, the judge's daughter, who had traveled from Rapid City specifically to meet him. "Governor," Catherine said, "I work at the Territorial Orphanage in Omaha that would be expanded under Mr. Crawford's proposal. I've seen what institutional life does to children, and I've also seen what the Cedar Falls families have accomplished. There is no comparison. She handed him a folder thick with documentation. These are outcome studies I've been conducting independently. Children who age out of institutional care have suicide rates 3 times higher than the general population. Criminal involvement rates twice as high, and economic productivity significantly lower. Meanwhile, every single child placed through the Cedar Falls model has not only survived, but flourished. Catherine's voice grew passionate. Governor, we have a choice. We can continue warehousing children until they're old enough to be released into a world they're unprepared for, or we can invest in communities that actually prepare them to succeed in life. The data is clear. Love works better than management. That night, Governor Blackwell requested a private meeting with Margaret and Thomas. They gathered in the parsonage, a simple room that seemed worlds away from the political complexity of territorial government. Mrs. Henderson, the governor began, I came here expecting to find a well-intentioned, but impractical experiment that needed to be replaced with professional management. Instead, I've discovered something I didn't know was possible. He paused, seeming to struggle with his words. I grew up in an institution myself, back in Massachusetts. I was told it was for my own good, that my widowed mother couldn't provide proper care. I spent my entire childhood believing that efficiency and order were more important than affection and individual attention. Margaret felt her heart soften toward this man she had seen as an enemy. What changed your mind, Governor? Watching your Emma speak today, he replied quietly, seeing the confidence and hope in her eyes. I never had that as a child. None of us in the institution did. We survived, as Mr. Crawford said, but we didn't thrive. Most of us spent our adult lives trying to fill a hole that should never have been there in the first place. Thomas leaned forward. So what happens now? Governor Blackwell was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the snow beginning to fall. Now we change everything, he said finally. The Cedar Falls model becomes the territorial standard. Instead of building large institutions, we'll invest in community-based family placement programs. Instead of managing children, we'll empower families. Margaret felt tears beginning to flow, and Mr. Crawford's proposal? Rejected, the governor said firmly. In fact, I'm recommending that he be investigated for his previous interference with legal child custody cases. Men who use children as pawns in business schemes have no place in child welfare policy. The transformation that followed was remarkable. Within a year, the Cedar Falls model had been implemented in 12 communities across the territory. Families who had never considered adoption found themselves opening their hearts and homes to children who needed them. The economic benefits were substantial instead of costly institutions that drained territorial resources. Communities were investing in their own futures by raising their own next generation. Margaret found herself appointed as the first territorial Director of Family Services, a position that allowed her to travel throughout the region, helping other communities develop their own programs. Thomas expanded the general store into a regional business that employed dozens of people, many of them young adults who had grown up in the program. 5 years after that snowy morning when she had found 7 children in a blizzard shelter, Margaret stood in the same church where they had fought to save their family, now officiating at Samuel's wedding to Catherine Morrison. The church was packed with the extended family they had created, not just their own 8 children, but dozens of others who had found homes through the program, along with the families who had opened their hearts to them. Emma, now 16 and preparing to attend the Territorial Teachers College, served as maid of honor. She had grown into a young woman of remarkable grace and wisdom. Her early trauma transformed into compassion that drew people to her like a beacon. As Margaret watched Samuel and Catherine exchange vows, she reflected on the journey that had brought them all to this moment. A desperate woman accepting a mail-order marriage had become a community leader who had changed territorial policy. 7 dying children had become productive citizens who were now raising the next generation. A small frontier town had become a model for the entire territory, but perhaps most importantly, they had proven that love was not just a feeling but a choice, a daily decision to see potential where others saw problems, to build families where others saw inconvenience, and to create hope where others accepted despair. After the wedding reception, as the November snow fell softly outside, Margaret and Thomas walked home together through the quiet streets of Cedar Falls. Their house, now expanded multiple times and always full of activity, awaited them with warm lights glowing in every window. "Any regrets?" Thomas asked, taking her hand as they walked. Margaret thought of the woman she had been before that blizzard, afraid, desperate, willing to settle for security without love. Then she thought of the woman she had become, confident, purposeful, surrounded by a family and community that she had helped to create. "Only one," she said, smiling up at her husband. "I wish I could go back and tell that frightened woman on the stagecoach that sometimes the worst storms lead to the most beautiful destinations." As they reached their front door, they could hear the sounds of their family inside: teenage laughter, Tommy practicing piano, the twins arguing good-naturedly about some artistic technique, Mary reading to the younger children who still occasionally joined their household. Margaret paused on the threshold, listening to these sounds of home, and marveled at the truth she had learned, that families weren't just born, they were built. Built with intention and dedication, with hope and hard work, with the radical belief that love could triumph over any obstacle. The mail-order bride, who had found 7 frozen orphans in a blizzard shelter, had discovered something more valuable than security or even happiness. She had discovered her purpose, to prove that every child deserved not just survival, but the chance to thrive in the warmth of chosen family. And in the end, that made all the difference. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.